these pictures again, these photographs. I had the great pleasure, soon after he won the Nobel Prize, when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, of being Gunnar Myrdal's host for the 3 days he was on campus. But I hadn't seen these photographs of Gunnar Myrdal and Friedrich Hayek before. But I realized these photographs were taken only 30 seconds after each was told who they'd shared. So we're open for questions. Over here.
David Castaldi. I can make an argument.
David, could you just tell us a little bit in 2 seconds what you do?
Retired biotechnology executive. I can make an argument that the United States government, starting after World War II, and then the United States workers, starting in the 1980s, has subsidized the development of the underdeveloped world, starting with Western Europe, moving on to Korea, and then to Japan and Korea, and then countries like the underdeveloped countries like China and India that are going on now, with Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa in the waiting to be subsidized. And my question, therefore, is, despite all the economic theory, isn't there a problem with globalization in terms of providing this subsidy at the expense of American worker wages to a seemingly ever-increasing number of underdeveloped people that are going to threaten the American worker? And I guess I would ask you, Professor, to comment on that.
Well, this is a deep concern and a lot of concern over globalization. But let me take your two examples and contrast them. Yes, we rebuilt Europe, the Marshall Plan, but we rebuilt Europe in an era of sustained growth in the United States. And you had open markets in Europe for American goods, for American technology, for American knowledge workers to go and help rebuild the countries that were devastated in Europe and around the world. And so what we need is open markets where we can take our intellectual knowledge and we can take our research and development ideas and we can grow with the expansion of markets in the developing world, or as we did after World War II. We got the greatest consumer boom after World War II, not just certainly from pent-up demand in the domestic economy, but also because we were active in investing around the world. If we can just capture our share of the growth in world markets, we would be just fine. The problem is that we've allowed American companies to offshore jobs without any penalties. We've allowed American companies to get benefits from parking their assets and their profits overseas. So we should stop that, but we should also make sure that we have a balanced growth policy so that we encourage firms to invest where their markets are growing, but also to make sure that the R&D and the manufacturing and the servicing jobs are also growing here in the United States. It's that balanced growth. And let me give you one company example, and I don't think I'm talking out of schools. Everyone knows the Mars company because we all eat too much of their candy, but they're a pretty diversified food and pet food and manufacturing. And they have a policy of investing in markets overseas, but also reinvesting in their manufacturing capacity in the United States. And so they develop markets, they put capacity where in underdeveloped countries where the markets are growing, but they consistently have a policy of balancing that with growth in the United States because they are really a strong believer in their role as a citizen in this country. Now, they're not a publicly traded company, they're a family-owned company, and that's one of the reasons they can do it. So we've got to have more of those kinds of organizational policies. We have to have a government policy that doesn't try to cut us off from expanding overseas, but that ensures that there's a see the trade-off between growth and growing the developing countries and the United States. And I'll tell you where the frontier is. The frontier is a continent that we have avoided, and that's Africa. The next decade, we are going to see tremendous growth in the African continent. And if we can capture that by supporting growth there, but with American resources and with American know-how and with American exports, I think we'll get back on track.
Next question.
I'm David Bank. I'm a housing economist with HUD. My question is actually about infrastructure. We heard in both presentations about how infrastructure has been an example of government intervention in markets, and also about how the largest share of the jobs outside from GDP growth, the 4 million new jobs, could be from infrastructure, rebuilding bridges, improving broadband, etc. But we're in a political situation where we're talking about cutting federal budgets and reducing spending. So I guess my question is, how do we pay for the infrastructure expenditures that seem to be both needed and also potentially could be a huge source of jobs?
Well, I think it starts with private investment. Only if business and labor, which they agree on, that's one of the few things that you can get some consensus on between business and labor, at least progressive business leaders in the United States today. But they've got to go together to Congress and say, we will put up a good chunk of the financing for infrastructure, but we also need the equivalent of the municipal bonds, the municipal tax breaks that support public investment. And we need a couple of other things from the federal government. We will manage it. We'll manage it with you in a public-private partnership. And over the long haul, we will reinvest. The labor movement has said, at least in principle, they're willing to invest about $10 billion in pension funds. Now that's only about 10% of what's needed to really get started in this area. But it's a start, and if we said to Wall Street, you've got the resources to invest, and it can be a reasonable rate of return, not a quick return, but a reasonable long rate of return with these kinds of investments. I think we could get there, but it takes that kind of leadership. So, and yes, it will take some government expenditures to support this, to support the private sector, but that's the way to do it. Because I agree with you, we're not going to get a public infrastructure bank funded just with taxpayer dollars. That's, as much as I think that's actually preferable to a public-private for a variety of reasons, we're not going to get there, so we can do it an alternative way.
John, do you want to add anything to that?
I've already used up more than my time, so
Next question.
My name is Margaret Wheeler. I'm an attorney and not an economist, so this may be a very basic question. But I'd like to go back to the first question about globalization and some of the negative impacts of globalization. I wonder if that's not inevitable, cooked into the pie, if we live in a world where money and goods are relatively free to circulate around the world, but people are not free to move. In other words, to move from a low-paying labor market to a high-paying labor market. Aren't we always going to have the kinds of inequities that we see in globalization if people are basically locked into their national borders?
Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that there's much more cross-border mobility than we realize. And to the extent that we bring enormous numbers of bright young people, I'm sure there are people in this room from other countries, and educate them here in the United States at our good universities. And those people sometimes stay in the United States for a period of time. I wish more of them would. But they go back to their countries, and to the extent that you can build what we now call circular migration, you get the benefits of building networks and building contacts and people who get this kind of virtual cycle of economic development back in their home country, but help to create businesses for law firms, for financial institutions, for suppliers and supply base here in the United States and in other countries. So yes, globalization, and yes, labor is less mobile than capital for sure, but there's more mobility and there's more opportunities for us to develop the next generation of talent continuing to invite for both in person and through our external online resources, the development and the education of people around the country, around the world, so that they can move to where there are opportunities, and so they can upgrade their economies as developing countries are hoping to do, and not get caught in kind of a low wage equilibrium, so that as they grow, we can grow. Globalization is a reality. We're not going to turn back the clock. We're not going to put up borders and barriers to trade in a significant way, but we can have a policy that really balances the growth of other countries with growth in the United States. And I think we're getting a little closer to that, but I think we've got a long way to go.
Question?
Jacqueline Calderon. I run a program for the shelter in Boston. What would you recommend for organizing a union?
I had a fascinating conversation with someone who I won't identify, but with one of our largest unions in the United States, a relatively young professional who's been given the task of answering that question. And it was a long conversation.
By the way, can you all hear in the back?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you might want to speak a little louder.
And so,
What was the question?
the question is, what would you do to organize unions and rebuild unions for, especially for low-income people, people living in shelters and others? We need to rebuild the labor movement. Let's start with that basic premise, because without some power and ability to move to scale and to sustain that power over time, we're just not going to get the kind of pressure to get wages moving with productivity and to get a more equitable shared prosperity. But we're not going to do it in the mirror image. First of all, our labor law is completely broken, and so any employer, lawyer with legal advice can avoid unions legally or illegally with no consequence. So forget labor law and forget marginal changes in labor law like have been proposed with the Employee Free Choice Act and other similar kinds of bills. We need to create more organizations, more self-organization. We need to use the social media. We need to create networks of young people who are sharing information on where jobs are and using media to expose bad practices. The fact that Apple is now really working to address its problems in China because of the scandals of Foxconn, and the fact that Nike has been doing the same kind of thing of trying to upgrade labor standards in their contractor and supplier base, is not because they're just doing it voluntarily. It's because of the social pressure from young people, from consumers, from students against sweatshops, from worker centers in those countries, from NGOs. So we're going to need a mosaic of new organizing strategies, using the worker centers in our cities to educate and to represent workers, legal services for people whose basic wages and overtime are not being provided. We're going to need to rebuild unions as knowledge-based organizations. That's why I emphasize apprenticeship. So there's no single model, but we're not going back to unions and collective bargaining just as we knew them. We've got to have a wide variety of ideas. Where I ended up with this colleague the other day was to say what we need to do is the equivalent of these innovation centers and incubators. We need to find ways of supporting new startup ideas and testing and experimenting with a variety of new approaches, and then funding those and finding ways to support those or to build sustainable organizations from the ground up. And it's up to your generation to come up with some of those ideas, because changing from within, like this young fellow is trying to do, it's very difficult because of the embedded policies and politics and structures. So yes, we need to rebuild unions, but we need to build them in a new image and with a range of new strategies, get away from the formalism of labor law where employers can resist and unions dissipate their resources by fighting legal battles, and just empowering people to organize in more natural and modern ways.
Question?
My name is Rod Cannon, I'm a teacher. Professor Coach, I have a question for you on one of your slides. If I remember correctly, it showed a growth of 7.1 million jobs by growing GDP. But don't you need jobs to grow GDP? Isn't it a circular argument?
Well, you certainly need to rebuild purchasing power to sustain that. Yes, absolutely. That estimate is right out of the Council of Economic Advisors estimate. If you get between 2 and 3% GDP growth over the rest of the decade, that's essentially what our traditional models would predict you will get in terms of jobs. Now, there's some debate about whether we're still generating the same number of jobs per percentage growth in GDP, so that could even be a bit of an overstatement. But yes, the way in which we have traditionally gotten growth in jobs or growth in GDP is by strong purchasing power. 70% of our economy is consumer-based economy, so we've got to improve the wages and the purchasing power of people to sustain that over time. But that's a reasonably modest estimate of what GDP growth would get. How we get that growth, as your question suggests, is not automatic. We do need to have the kind of investment, stimulus, and improved wages to sustain.
Thank you. Question?
Hello, my name is Brian Gobel. I'm a fifth-year finance student here at Northeastern, currently in co-op at the Federal Reserve. My question is, what role do you think immigration reform can play in the recovery?
Well, immigration reform, there is no single immigration reform. Clearly, we need to start to enforce with stronger sanctions against employers who are bringing workers in and then holding down their rights and not enforcing our labor laws and our employment laws and our wage laws. There's tremendous abuse there. We clearly do need to encourage more high-end immigration. That's why I'm in favor of having more of our college graduates that we train and educate here to stay in the United States and not have such a difficult time getting visas, so that they can then engage, build their networks here, and then perhaps go back to their countries and draw on the contacts and the business relationships that they've built here. We do need to enforce our boundaries and try to stop as much of the illegal immigration as is happening. So it's a composite of policies. The Congress has come close a couple of times to enacting a comprehensive reform, but right now, frankly, the politics are so polarized that it's going to take a long time before we get back to a balanced enforcement of our and security at our boundaries, encouraging high-end immigration, enforcing the loss of those people who are working in the low-wage jobs, rights are respected, and then move on from there.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. Please.
Yes, my name is Jerry Berwick. I'm an attorney locally here in Boston. My question is this. I mean, it seems to me that the big problem we have in this country is that education-wise, we seem to be falling behind, that other countries throughout the world seem to be ahead of us. I think I saw something where it said we, as far as the science and math is concerned, we were our students came in something like 27th in the world. And so we have that issue, plus of course we're having, kids go through college and get training, and it turns out that after they're through with their college education and so forth, they have debt that, that's astronomical. It could be anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000, and if they're going through graduate school, I heard of one guy who was, who trained to become a lawyer. He had $300,000 in student debt, and he wanted to go into public policy law, which, I mean, it would take him probably a lifetime before he could pay off that debt if he could get a job in public policy law. What do you suggest should be done in order to be able to fix this situation? Because without fixing this situation, we're not going to get the people well-trained for the jobs that are going to be out there.
Well, there's no simple fix to the education challenges we face. What Barry and I are trying to do here in Massachusetts with elementary education, I think is part of that solution. We've got to improve our elementary education, particularly in our poorest and urban schools, and that requires showing some dignity to the teachers and to their organizations and to the principals who are working on these issues, and giving them the kind of support and resources they need to upgrade their capacity, hold them accountable, and really build the strong public education system that so many of us, certainly that I benefited from growing up in rural Wisconsin. And so that's clearly a challenge. I think Race to the Top, while it's controversial, it's got some features that we can all quarrel with, is making tremendous strides, and we'll see some improvements, significant improvements over the next few years from those investments. So I think that's going in the right direction. We can't attack teachers and expect them to do a good job in the classroom any more than any of us can do a decent job if we feel we are under attack. Then there's a whole set of middle skill jobs, and that's why apprenticeships, community colleges, working with industry are so important. We're going to have 25 million new openings for middle skill jobs in the rest of this decade, from retirements and from job growth. If we don't really rebuild our capacity to fill those jobs with high quality people who can earn a decent living and move into the middle class, then more of those jobs will migrate overseas. And then finally, on the college side, it used to be our parents could say to us, play by the rules, follow your dreams, get an education, whatever your interests you have, and all will be well. Those days are over. Now we've got to really focus our young people to go where the jobs are, in the technology concentration, to get good math training, to get good behavioral science training, to work in teams and communicate and to implement new ideas. But this mix of technical and behavioral skills is what's going to drive our economy in the future. We've got to make sure that our students are getting that mix of education as they leave. And then finally, I think we all have a responsibility to bring down the cost of higher education. We are pricing ourselves out of the market, and we will pay a consequence, or pay a price for that. The student debt load that you mentioned is problematic, and it's particularly problematic. Some schools, and I think Northeastern is one of them, provides some payback or some forgiveness of student debt if people go into public service jobs or go into the inner city and teach. We got to do more of that, and we could help to address some of the debt problems. But we got to get our costs under control and stop the escalation of higher education costs well above the rate of inflation as it has been for the last decade.
That's a terrific question. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the State House, I will be joining Governor Patrick and the Commissioner of Higher Education, Richard Freeland, former president of Northeastern University, and Paul Revel, the Secretary for Education, where we're going to be looking at exactly that question about the future of public higher education in the Commonwealth, from the community college to the four-year universities. So that issue is going to be high on our list tomorrow. One last question.
Yes, unfortunately my question is rather broad. My name is Gordon and I'm an MA student here. Professor, in the draft paper you wrote for this, you quoted the Sloan Foundation President Ralph Gomorrah in 2010, saying that government leaders do not realize that the corporate goal of profit maximization at all costs does not serve the interests of the nation. They do not realize that the fundamental goals of the country and of the companies have diverged. Now, Professor, I understand the need for, rhetorical flourish on the part of Ralph Gomorrah, but it seems to me that they do not realize is a slightly strong statement. I wonder if I could ask you if you think that there are perhaps any broader political or perhaps even ideological reasons as to why government hasn't addressed this earlier.
Well, first of all, let me tell you who Ralph Gomory is. He's retired now, but he was the president of the Sloan Foundation. But he was also the chief scientist for IBM. So he is a business executive, a very bright business executive, who fostered innovation at IBM through most of his career. So he doesn't come at this as a raving socialist. He comes at it as a business leader, a very thoughtful business leader. And he has been making that point for a number of years, and that's why I emphasize the same point, that there's a disjuncture between the interests of the individual firm and the overall economy. And so he really believes that he would go stronger in terms of tax policy and tariff policies to promote more cooperative and collaborative business community initiatives here in the United States than you and I was suggesting here tonight. Why doesn't government do it? It's very simple. Both parties are very dependent on Wall Street, and have been, are, and will be. And as we heard from John, the Wall Street bailout and the restructuring came with no strings attached and no consequences of the kind that you argued are essential for bringing about change. That's the fundamental problem. It's a political problem. It's a political power problem. It's a political interest group and a financing problem that both the Republican and Democratic parties are so dependent on. And until, the Occupy Wall Street was a start, it was sort of a blip on the screen, but until the American public demands that we get the Wall Street emphasis back under control, until we demand that business start to respond to the needs of the community and the needs of the workforce, and we start to show that there are ways to do that, as we've talked about here tonight, I don't think we will see the politicians be leading this change. They will react to this change if the pressures are strong enough, and if the public sends a strong enough message in this election that they are fed up with this, then perhaps we will see some change. But it's going to take a strong, sustained public pressure to bring our politicians around.
John?
Let me just add.
The last word. The
Yes.
last word.
Well, let me second what Thomas said, and in response in particular to that question, the issue of why the Wall Street experience, the bailout experience with respect to Wall Street is different is apropos here. There are, I think, two separate dovetailing factors. I mean, one is that where in an earlier era, the mantra of what's good for GM is good for the country seems pretty quaint right now, because the auto industry's importance in this country has, of course, diminished as its magnitude, as its clout has, and it's really been replaced by Wall Street. The financialization of the economy that Tom talks about and other people are concerned about has shifted the locus of political and economic power to an entirely different sector. So the reasons why Wall Street got away without the quid pro quo in 2008, 2009, I think speaks a lot about the changing balance of power within sectors of the U.S. economy. The other reason, sadly, has to do, I think, with personalities. The people who were responsible for devising policy with respect to the financial sector were individuals who with first names like Alan and Tim and Larry, who had their fingerprints on some of the were advocates of Wall Street, had worked in Wall Street, and had their fingerprints on some of the mistakes that had been made previously. And when they moved into the administration, many of us suspected that there would not really be an enforcement of quid pro quo. And I think sadly that too has proven to be the case. And the concern is that, without the quid pro quo, with Wall Street advocates solidly entrenched in the administration, and with the diminished power of other sectors relative to the banking sector, that this raises some real issues and concerns about the health of our body politic.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank our two speakers. Next week, we're going to have a real close look at monetary policy and what it can or perhaps cannot do to stimulate the economy at this time. And again, with us will be Eric Rosenberg, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and introducing him will be our dear friend Kathy Minahan. In one semester, the second semester of the Open Classroom, taught this course with us, who's now the Dean of the Simmons College of the School of Management, and indeed the former President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Hope you'll be with us next week for what will be another stimulating evening in the Open